So we have two Michaelas today, which we think is really special. It's very rare.
Yeah.
I'm Mikaela Kiner. I'm the founder and CEO of Reverb, and we have a very special guest today. If you want to introduce yourself, Michaela.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. My name is Michaela Ayers. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the founder of Nourish, which is a social impact organization that advances inclusive education within corporations and within communities. And super excited to be with my other Michaela counterpart. I feel like whenever we're together, I just get so excited for the conversations that we share. So that's a little bit about me.
That's awesome. And I use she, her pronouns too. I don't know why. I think Zoom has thrown me, and I've been share my pronouns. So thank you for the reminder, which is actually a great segue. We're here to talk about inclusion and acts of everyday inclusion, which is something that is really core to Michaela's business and also to our beliefs and values. And feeling though like this is also actually important right now, given so many things that are happening as a result of the COVID virus. One that we know, right, which is some bias that has come out and kind of been demonstrated given some people's beliefs about the virus and where it originated. The other is just being, even more thoughtful about how we include each other when we're distributed, we're remote, we're working on these virtual platforms, and it's not something that is as familiar with or as comfortable with. So I think it increases the burden and the onus on us to make sure that we're really taking that extra step as leaders and being inclusive of others. I would love, Michaela, for you to start and just very simple yet define us what is inclusion, and as we're talking about today, what does it mean to you?
Absolutely. And I love asking this question to other people too, because I think inclusion means different things to different people. So I think of it in two ways. Inclusion is a verb, an action verb to include, but it's also a feeling of like, I feel included. So it's really recalling on whether you're a receiver or you're the person on the action end of it, it's to really require you to look around and notice who is in and who is out. So I feel like inclusion, it's kind of a lens that once you have it on, you can't turn it off, and you become more aware of your space in the world and how you interact with other people.
Yeah, thank you. And I like that, thinking about it from both sides. And I know we've all experienced feeling included, and we've also all experienced feeling excluded. And I think it's just good to recall those situations and the emotions around them as we're talking today. The goal today is to be as interactive as possible and is to take your questions. We also have some backup questions in case we need them, and there's a lot that we can talk about, but I do want to pause and just share. You can ask a question by unmuting yourself. You're most welcome to come on the video. If you haven't showered, you don't have to come on the video, although you're still welcome. You can raise your hand. You can also in chat. If you just submit a question, it'll go to the whole group, or if you'd rather submit your question anonymously, you can share it with Kylie. You want to wave, Kylie? You can share with Kylie, and then she'll read out the question for us to answer. So I want to just pause before we dive in and ask, does anyone have a question, or do you have a particular topic around inclusion that you're hoping we'll cover today? Megan has a question. Yes, Megan?
I'm typing.
Okay, perfect.
Actually, I'll make it easier. Thanks, Michaela. Thanks both, Michaela. Hi, Michaela and Michaela. And I'm sorry I'm not on camera, but I'm sitting here in pajamas stuffing my face with Cheez-Its. So
That's great.
That's the right thing to do.
no camera today. I'm really curious what kinds of practices you see happening right now that you hope employers are going to continue on the other side of this.
Michaela, do you want to go first?
No, go ahead.
I mean, I hope remote work becomes, it's already it was already pretty normal, but I think that I'm really excited to see how this changes things for people in the disability community, who I think have been asking for this type of thing for a really long time. And so I hope that this period makes people a lot more aware of the little things, you know, that we do that can be transferred into a virtual format to be more inclusive of other people.
Yeah, yeah. I think there was a really brief window for some parents when they were working from home and their kids were still in school, where parents saw flexibility that was also really helpful to them. And my hope is that teams and leaders who maybe were skeptical about remote work or thought, well, you're not really working when you're home or you're not really productive, have now learned that people are absolutely working hard and they're absolutely productive, and that just some little bits of flexibility are tremendously helpful to a variety of people for different reasons. I also just see people taking a lot better care of one another, whether that's really checking in about how people are doing and feeling before diving into business, taking time to check in with people and be more intentional about connecting with folks. And I hope some of that will stick around too, because even though now we're doing it for a very obvious reason, even when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, we all have stuff that goes on for us, you know, in our personal life or in our work life. And we all have emotions that can be up and down. And I actually think that checking in with people as people more frequently is something that would be really healthy.
Yeah, I agree. I think I would double click on that and just say, I think people are really in the mindset of putting people first right now. And I hope that continues like as a practice.
Yeah, yeah. I see we have another question from Francis. Do you have examples from companies you feel are really adopting the right kinds of actions? I might start with that. I mean, you know, we've seen some really big company examples in terms of how they're engaging with their customers, right? And whether that's waiving cancellation fees is a really big one that comes to mind, but just kind of back to this old notion of putting the customer first and not penalizing the customer for a lot of small changes. I think that's a really positive cultural sign. We've seen companies like Alaska Airlines was one of the first that I saw, at least, who shared a communication like that. I also think the companies who were really quick to invite employees to, you know, don't come in if you're not comfortable, feel free to work from home, don't feel that you have to travel if you think that's putting you at risk. So I think Michaela's phrasing of people first is definitely something that we've seen showing up a lot. I have one more thought and then I'll turn it over, which is a lot of companies are offering free services where they can that are benefiting the community. I know a lot of organizations that work in the mental health or counseling or crisis space are doing everything from free counseling to free hotlines, free, you know, meditation links, right? I do really see people coming out and bonding together and doing everything they can to support one another. And I love that. And I also hope that that doesn't go away.
Yeah, I think I would add on to that in terms of, yeah, noticing the groundswell of offerings right now in terms of offering, whether it's mental health or whether it's offering free services. I think people are really kind of lowering the barriers to entry right now. And I think I'm excited to see, you know, how is that helping people continuing to collaborate and create at this time, you know, especially when maybe you're not super tech savvy or maybe you don't have a background in virtual facilitation or things like that. I feel like I've noticed more and more people putting together resources, you know, like for their communities or for people who work with them, just to kind of give them a place to start, give people a direction, which is, you know, really valuable in this time where it's hard to know where to start.
Yeah. So there's a follow-on question from Justin. How do we ensure that lip service matches actions in organizations? Michaela, I might let you take that.
Yeah, well, I think that's always kind of the hard part, right? But I think that kind of leads to, I think, what is the role of a leader in a time of uncertainty. And so I think it's the role of a leader to kind of eliminate fear and to be as transparent as possible. So to me, when it's coming down to lip service, I personally would want to know, like, what metrics are we going to start to focus on now when it comes to inclusion or giving people access to information? What metrics are the most valuable? And then what is the communication strategy around that? Not only for the employees, but also for customers, and really keeping a pulse on that, making sure there is some kind of clear and transparent way that organization is putting that message out of, this is what we're going to be accountable to, this is what we're committed to, this is what we're supporting, this is the communication strategy that supports it. And then, you know, rolling that out to say, you know, 30% of so-and-so's time, or however it will be allotted, because I know there's a lot of triaging happening. But I would really, you know, I would really encourage leaders to put together an action plan. Try to get people involved who maybe wouldn't traditionally be involved, again, like thinking about inclusion and thinking about who's in the room. Be collaborative in how you're creating that action plan. You know, if it includes frontline workers, then they should be involved in co-creating that action plan with you. And then consistency, you know, being really clear and concise and direct around, you know, what it is that you value, how you're going to go about executing it, and then how is that going to impact the communities that you serve.
Yeah, I always think of this phrase too, which is that organizations emulate their leaders. And so if a leader is sort of espousing that they're a good Samaritan and a good citizen and, you know, trying to portray themselves that way, but they actually don't act that way internally and don't treat their employees like that, there's just going to be a huge disconnect, because the employees are so much more likely to behave in the way that they're treated. And I think that's just going to show up in the type of service that they provide and the way that they engage with others. Frances had a clarification, so we answered a different question. She said, I meant less about today's climate and more about D&I training and culture changes that we're embracing D&I, and it's not just words on the wall. So Michaela, just so back to her original question, it was, what are the examples of companies you feel are adopting the right kind of actions in the DEI space?
Well, I think that's challenging because it's not a one size fits all. It really depends. I think the companies I've seen who are doing it right, quote unquote, right for them, right for their culture, are the ones that are starting with leaders first. Kind of like a top-down and bottom-up strategy, right? So it's like leaders are really, you know, of course, like Michaela just said, like they're the owners of culture, but there's also very oftentimes a grassroots nature of DEI work. There's lots of individual contributors who are inspired and excited to be doing this work. So in my mind, the companies who are doing it right are experimenting with kind of serving both communities at the same time, you know, building an ERG group for those employees so they can have buy-in, but also training leaders so they can understand what DEI means and how it affects their business, and then creating a strategy that aligns with their values and tying diversity and inclusion metrics into that, and, you know, kind of making that a symbiotic relationship, making sure that those employees have access to those leaders and vice versa. That's what I see be successful. That's how I like to work with my clients. So it's not a, again, not like one size fits all. It very much depends. But I think that that's the kind of strategy that I've seen work best, is when there's a little experimentation, right? It's going to be messy. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be all qualitative. It's going to be human-centered, and it's going to be kind of like all happening at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would say a couple of the things that we've observed, and I love two things that you just said. One was the iteration, because companies have to keep, you know, trying and maybe not veering off course, but changing course to understand what works best for their teams and their employees, and how to get people actively engaged in these conversations. The other piece is it's messy and it's hard. And we have one client where the sponsor has been really great about repeating that message every time there's an engagement, and like, this is messy and it's hard, and I'm not going to be perfect and you're not going to be perfect either, and we all have to have grace with each other. We have to acknowledge when we make a mistake and be accountable and apologize. At the same time, you know, we have to accept that from others, right? I think that's been a really important part of the message that has lowered the barrier and enabled people to participate The other thing, that we see with the sponsors is that they're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, not just when they're hosting a training or hosting an event. They're talking about it at all times as a part of culture. And so they're bringing it up in other meetings and other discussions, or, sharing examples of maybe a bright spot where they had a success, or maybe a spot where, they said the wrong thing and apologized and moved through it. And I think we just see that really humanizes the work.
Yeah. Well, I had one client say that they do like a Friday fail. They like, everybody gets together and they talk about something that they tried and maybe just didn't work. So just like normalizing that, I think, is a big part of doing the work.
Yeah, I love that. So we have a comment from Dia. I personally struggle with what feels like an oversaturation of information without creating the time and space to implement those practices. How do we push leaders to focus on prioritization over productivity, which actually frees us up to take care of ourselves and our communities and those in need at this time? So it's kind of a maybe too much activity, too much information without the time for people to embrace it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I feel like I hear in there too is the tendency to try to do too much, to try to boil the ocean, which is something I try to steer people away from often. So yeah, I would try to encourage that leader or that organization to boil it down to maybe 3 things, the 3 things that really are most essential to your business. And then how does DEI intersect with that? Because it does. No matter what industry you're in or what size you are, there are at least three pillars that you can think of, or strategies that you can think of that intersect with diverse perspectives and treating people, with equity, like applying an equity lens to it. So I think, trying to narrow that down was probably what I would, because I agree. I think there's a lot of things a leader can be focused on, but if we could really kind of consolidate that energy, that would be, I think, a good strategy.
Yeah. Mikaela, to make it tangible for people, could you share what might 1 or 2 of those examples be where the business goals do intersect with DEI, maybe an example that you've used or that you've seen?
Sure. So I guess one that could come up is, if a company is in growth mode, right? I think this is probably the most common one, where it's like maybe they have exceeded they have like sales goals. So they need to hire a lot of staff in order to meet those sales goals. So then it becomes a question of what are your hiring practices? When it comes to who gets hired, who gets promoted, who gets fired, really starting to think about how can I bring in diverse people, knowing that, people from different backgrounds have the best performance. So I would start with something like that. So then it's like a conversation about recruitment and interviews and job descriptions. I think that's like a really tangible and accessible starting place for a lot of companies. If it is maybe like product development, getting feedback from your customers, making sure that customer base that you're talking to is diverse. The people that you're talking to every day, your customers, really reaching out and going deep into, the demographics of that group, making sure that they reflect the diversity that you want to see. So those are just a couple examples that I think could be meaningful. Another one that comes up for me is, executive leadership, the diversity of that group, making sure that there is some semblance or value in the representation of that group. Because I think those are 3 places that as a consumer, I look, I see who works there, who's the leader of that organization, and what type of customer base do they have. So I think those 3 touch points would be a good place to start.
Yeah, those are great. I was trying to think of any others. The other, I think even from a conversation like what we're having right now, and leaders can do this too, is just asking people, what is one action that you're willing to commit to coming out of this conversation? It could be something you're going to do differently, someone that you're going to have a different kind of conversation with. Maybe to Michaela's first point was, what's one thing we can do to decrease the bias in our interview and hiring process. And so while the information might feel overwhelming, I think if we allow people to take a small step and know that every small step is really important and valuable, that's another way not to overwhelm folks. Question from Joe. What guidance do you have for folks who are managing meetings in online environments that can make inclusive communication feel more normal?
I love this question, Joe. This is good. So I guess I hear two parts of it. One, what can I do to make my virtual meetings feel more inclusive? And then how can I use inclusive language and maybe just normalize that? So I have a soft spot in my heart for meetings. I think that the way that we form norms around how we gather is really important. So I guess I would do a first gut check around the norms of your meeting culture. You know, is there an agenda? Are there clear expectations of what will be the outcome? You know, using inclusive language in that agenda, normalizing that. The other thing I would say is just start to notice who speaks up most, you know, and are they being rewarded? And that reward could look a lot of different ways, right? Are they getting that stretch assignment? Are they the person that just, you know, is an extrovert and we reward extroverts at my company? Just get curious about that and how that's leading to decisions being made. And then again, with that inclusive communication in the follow-up and in the next meeting, just reinforcing, you know, things like whether it's using, you know, introducing pronouns at the beginning of every meeting, whether that's, you know, being mindful of the different types of personas, introverts, extroverts at the meeting. Just naming that, I think, is really powerful for people. And so using meetings as a little bit of an experimentation ground for checking on those types of things.
Yeah. I also feel like unless people are really good facilitators, often in-person meetings aren't that inclusive either. You know, the same things that Michaela was just mentioning of, you know, does the extrovert get all the airtime, or do certain people get interrupted? And the shift to virtual meetings could almost give us an excuse to just improve our meeting etiquette, right? Because I think this is a time where people are interested in how do we do this virtually? You know, how do we raise our hand? How do we know whose turn it is to speak? And, you know, we might have to call on people by name because on, you know, video, everyone can talk all at once because we don't see body language. But those are really good habits that'll just translate right back into in-person meetings when we're having them again.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, I'm sorry, go ahead,
Michaela,
Joe.
I think what I've actually noticed is people telling me that when we move to these conversations where we have to be intentional about things like turn taking and having to actually having to raise our hands, as opposed to just talking over each other the way we often do in meetings. I've had people telling me that this feels weird. And I've tried to get, you know, it's like, yes, because you've been doing this so atrociously without saying, look, because you've been so atrocious before this, now you have to be polite and now you have to be inclusive. And that's what we've been talking about all along.
Yeah.
Right. Convincing them that this is actually maybe better habits and better ways of doing things when we say, yeah, we're going to do an intentional invitation, you know, mutual invitation, and you pick the next person who's going to speak until everybody's had their chance. Making sure that you can see and hear everybody, and that everybody knows who's talking. And gosh, I've always wanted to have a meeting where I had a mute button. Right? There's always been somebody. I thought, gosh, if I could just make them stop.
I might quote you on that.
Right, that now we have one. But we're not used to having to exercise any of that. And how do we help facilitators exercise that power to do these things in inclusive ways when it's been hard to exercise that kind of control?
I think that's absolutely right. And I think what's true too is a manager has not been trained how to be a facilitator. I don't think those are the same. And so I think people are stepping into this now uncomfortable role. That's what I hear when I see people are saying it's weird. It's uncomfortable now to be the person to have to assign the role of you have the speaking for. And so that's why I think, again, in the agenda making, and that's where you really have the chance to build the norms in around how we're going to be communicating, how we're going to be interacting online. So that way people have a really clear understanding of, oh, this person's in control. I'm in really good hands. Like, I know now how I need to act. And then they will, I think that eases everyone's anxiety online.
Yeah. When we talk about inclusion, I actually hear a lot of folks talking about introversion versus extroversion. And I'm an introvert, and I worked in very extroverted companies, Microsoft and Amazon, for much of my career. And there were a couple of leaders over the years who were, yeah, I guess they were good facilitators, but I'd say in particular, they're really good at recognizing when I had something to say, probably because I make a lot of faces, you know, when I interject, and calling on me. And I probably would have spoken about 10% as much as I did if they had paused and said, Michaela, it looks like you have to say, right? And that's one of those small but really great facilitation technique. I love Michaela's idea of, you know, setting the norms. Maybe you put it in the agenda, and then just keep your norms when you go back to those in-person meetings, right? Hopefully, depending how long this goes on, but people will start to recognize that it is effective and that voices are getting heard, and that there's value to these weird behaviors of listening to one another and taking turns.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. We've got Kiner. What norms/activities have you seen really move the needle when it comes to D&I within organizations?
Within organizations, was that the last part?
Yeah.
Well, one that I think is essential is being curious and using curiosity as a tool to fuel the work. So I use the norm get curious a lot when it comes to facilitating conversations, because oftentimes the conversations I'm facilitating they're challenging, right? And so get curious is asking people to notice not only information about themselves, but also notice information about other people. Don't use assumptions. Don't rely on stereotypes. Be genuinely curious. It's amazing how much more effective communication gets when you ask questions and don't use any kind of preconceived notion to come to an assumption. So that's one that I use often. And I feel like it's a really powerful one when it comes to, you know, curiosity being, I think, a lever for creativity. So that's one that I use often. And I think, you know, transparency also, I think that comes along with that. Being willing to be transparent. I think those are probably my top two right now, especially for organizations that are starting to do the work. I think transparency, of course, is coming to an honest place of where are we at? You know, what have we been doing? What have we not been doing? And applying that lens and seeing what can be communicated out in that kind of same transparent way, and being consistent with that.
Yeah, I love this. I have a little bit of a longer question from Suzanne. Do you see a lot of companies putting their DEI initiatives on the back burner with everything happening around COVID-19, whether that's deliberate or not? I was happy to receive a company-wide email this morning from my client who is recognizing today as Transgender Visibility Day and the importance of recognizing it during a time when people are focused on other things. I'm curious if you're seeing other companies keeping these practices and projects alive and suggestions to maintain them.
Well, I'll start by saying I have noticed that, of course, it's pulled back in some ways. And I think I don't believe that's forever, but I think that's a right now reality that a lot of companies are trying to find some stability. And so in my work, and what I've noticed in a lot of from my colleagues, that it has slowed down, like it has kind of dried up in a lot of capacities. But I believe that, you know, once we kind of like have adjusted into this place, I'm really hopeful that it'll get back to being a very like top priority. And I appreciate what they mentioned around like Transvisibility Day. Like we can't let this completely disrupt all of the work that we've done so far. And so I do think it's essential for us to keep going.
Yeah, I would just add to that some people are in survival mode. They're organizations and maybe individuals, but they're trying to figure out how to both respond to what's happening and perhaps how to keep this going and how to take care of their employees. For some people, that's all that they can manage right now, and that's understandable, right? Which is not to say, yeah, I wish, right? I hope is that inclusive kind behaviors will continue and are showing up throughout this. But I know there are some people who everything else has fallen wayside while they're just trying to figure out how to manage day to day. And for that, you know, there's a lot of forgiveness and a lot of grace for that, because there's only so much that people can keep in mind.
Yeah.
Can I add to that?
Please.
So I work for Treliant. We sell sexual harassment training as well as discrimination. I'm a diversity speaker as well. And so I manage all of our top clients, and what you shared is pretty accurate. Most of the HR directors that I'm working with are just drinking through a straw right now, trying to keep the operation going. Some of them are, you know, being able to use some time while people are at home to do trainings. But I've seen in general for the last 3 weeks, and I'm in Washington State, I see in general that, you know, everybody's not able to really focus on the normal things, and they're just trying to keep afloat at this point.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. The other thing that we've seen as a firm is that if people are looking for any kind of development or other initiatives, it's mainly been around helping people manage their anxiety. It's been around helping teams just stay engaged and connected, and then also helping people figure out the remote and distributed world, whether that's effective meetings or people who have never had to manage remote teams. So if there's a focus on anything, I think it's that. Let's see, any other questions? Otherwise, I mean, Mikaela, maybe what I'd love you to do is talk a little bit more about, you know, I think there's a slight difference when we talk about inclusion as a whole, you know, maybe how can organizations create an inclusive culture, which feels sort of like the big global question. But then talk to us about the everyday acts of inclusion. And, you know, maybe I'll play out the question that I posed earlier, like, what is something that each of us on this call could potentially think about differently or do tomorrow that could help us be more inclusive than we are today?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think one thing that comes up for me right away is just starting to, aside from starting to notice, which I think is one of the more powerful prompts that we can all start to practice. And when I say start noticing, I mean like the books on your shelves, the movies you watch, the people closest to you. Are you living a homogenized life? If you are, start just taking note of that. And maybe write down some goals that you have around that. It could be, you know, it could be as simple again as reading different types of books, looking at different types of movies, reaching out to people from different communities that don't look like you, and figuring out what you can learn, because there's a lot you can learn from people who are different. And I think once you kind of take a little, you know, just give yourself a little assessment. And then after you get onto the other side, you know, try to match that up with potentially what kind of unconscious bias is potentially fueling that. And one that the one that I find super interesting right now is this idea of distance bias. You know, that the people that are closest to you or the ideas that are closest to you are the things that are the most valuable. And I think at a time like this, that's incredibly true, right? Where it's like, you know, the people who are in your closest proximity or the people who you have aligned yourself with closest are the most valuable. But I think what's on the other side of that is potentially a missed opportunity to value a different idea, to value a different perspective. So just trying to, you know, investigate those biases. And I think the thing about that, of course, is acknowledging that we all have them. There's no getting around them. You'll never not have them, really. So when I say, I really think of it as taming them, you know, acknowledging that they're real, acknowledging that they're really impacting how you show up in the world, but you don't have to abide by them. You know, you can absolutely train yourself how to put yourself in those situations where you can come in contact with people who are different or behaviors that are different. So that's usually one of the very first things. After you do that assessment, start to kind of dig into what biases might be fueling that. And then where can you practice? And I think that comes up with who's closest to you that is really willing to give you feedback. You know, who is that good friend who's always honest with you about where you need to grow? Say, you know, this is what I've done, this is where I want to go, and then, you know, what else am I missing? You know, how else can I be potentially better? Because they're invested in your success, and they're, again, that good friend that's going to be honest with you. So I think that is a pretty consistent and clear path for somebody who is invested and wants to be inclusive, but maybe doesn't know where to start. I think starting there is a good, don't boil the ocean strategy.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I was just reflecting on that. I think your point that unconscious, like, bias doesn't make us bad people. We all have bias, right, of different kinds. We were raised in societies where there are different kinds of bias, or families where there are different kinds of bias. And the goal is not to eradicate that bias, because that is not something that we can do. But by increasing our awareness, we can change our intentionality. When that bias thought hits our mind, we can recognize it and change the action and the outcome, right? And I know that was something that made it easier for me. It's just when you recognize that thought, you're like, oh, okay, I disagree, right, with that unconscious thought that came to my mind. And so we can act with a lot of intention. What else, Michaela, can you share with us? I mean, I'd love to hear a little bit about your work, and maybe even some of the work that you are doing with Nourish to create and facilitate inclusive conversations, and also how that is pivoting right now in the virtual world.
Absolutely. So I guess what else? I feel like I've been spending time with 2 reports that I wanted to share with everyone, and I can put the links in the chat. One of them is a Deloitte Australia report that came out a few years ago, but I think what's impactful about the report, it's called like Inclusion, What's in My Soup, is it's really drawing on that correlation between high diversity and high inclusion and performance. And so why is inclusion important to high performing teams? So aside from that correlation of diversity, inclusion is performance, it's this idea that if employees perceive that their companies are supportive of diversity and inclusion, it increases their perception of fairness, and therefore increases their engagement, because employees, especially now, want to work at corporations that are really driven by their values. And so this report, which I will share in the link, it was reporting that employees were up to 80% more likely. It increased their engagement by 80%. And so I just thought that was really incredible. This idea of belonging, to include, right? That verb, that action to actively bring people in, companies who value that, and then also equally value those diverse perspectives. I think, you know, we're just going to continue to see these trends increase. And so for me and my business, obviously inclusive education is a really core, central part of my mission. And so, of course, you know, pre-COVID-19, I was doing in-person facilitation, workshops, trainings, and now I'm transitioning all of that into a virtual format. I feel really blessed to have had a background in virtual training through my previous employer, where I was doing strictly that primarily. So I'm pretty comfortable on Zoom, as Megan can attest to. And so transitioning into a digital format, I think is, exciting for me, because I think it kind of levels the playing field for so many people, like we said. And it also gives people a chance to, gain a new skill, like get comfortable online. And I think there's so many collaboration tools that have come out in the last 3 to 5 years that allow for virtual collaboration, like virtual brainstorming, the breakout rooms feature. There are ways for us to make sure that this isn't just death by PowerPoint, watching somebody facilitate that way. So I'm really interested in that. I'm still very driven by connection in everything that I do. And so to me, it's a challenge. I'm taking it as a creativity challenge to come up with experiences for people to still come and learn in a virtual format around values, which are really essential to how people show up in the world.
That's great. And someone's asking for the link, and I think you said you would put the links in the chat. And then what was the other report you've been looking at?
So the other one is probably one that more people are common with. It's the Deloitte Delivering Through Diversity report that came out in 2018. But I always reference that one because I think they've done a great job plotting the year-over-year results, since they've been doing the diversity report for quite a while. So I just put the Deloitte report in the chat for folks. I'm going to put the same for McKinsey. And then the other thing that I'm working on is, I believe that education should be accessible for all people. And I'm hopeful that this whole paradigm that we're in right now increases the accessibility of education to all people. But I'm creating an everyday inclusion class, which is actually going to go live next Wednesday. So anybody who wants virtual strategies in times of crisis, that is a class I'm putting on. I'll put the link in the chat for anybody who wants to come to that also. But it is going to be talking again about tactics and tools and things that people can use to be more inclusive, whether that's in meetings or, of course, whether that's just high level strategies. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in there as well.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing those. Whew, okay, that was a lot to take in. I'm just going to pause and see if anyone else has questions, and otherwise we're probably close to wrapping up. Feel free to unmute too if you want to ask anything. I think people are probably digging into those links. That's what I'm going to do.
Well, I'm curious for the people who are on the phone, how is it showing up for you right now? This idea of inclusion as a practice. I'm curious. You set time out of your day to join. So, but anybody would be willing to share?
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Sorry, it's a little muffled. My name is Dia. I work for Amazon. Michaela, it was amazing to hear you speak as usual. The insights that you offer are so practical and useful, so thank you for your time. Yeah, the way it's showing up, interestingly enough, for our company is because it's so large and decentralized, everybody has their own definition. And of course, there's a lot of pulling from everybody's own experiences. And what I personally am looking for is how to stretch that experience beyond what our own personal experiences are. So there's a lot of privilege where a lot of us, not everybody, but a lot of us are working remotely, which in a situation where our jobs are intact right now. But how do we extend our understanding and our inclusion towards people even globally who are about to embark on the struggle of inequity and the ripple effects. And I think that's an important part of the conversation too, is not just like who's impacted in right now, but who will be impacted, who has been impacted, and really like extend that understanding. And I think having these conversations outside of like the workplace is an important part of understanding how it plays out in the workplace. So not sure if that's a question as much as a statement, but just wanted to say thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And good to hear your voice too, Dia. And I appreciate what you're saying around just being mindful of the ripple effects of this, knowing that it's going to, you know, it's not just going to be here in Seattle in our community, it's going to be across the world.
All right. Any final words, Michaela?
Final words. Well, I think I would say, you know, I think with all of the things that are happening right now, I've been attending a lot of free virtual things. So I feel like I'm connected to everyone who showed up here today. But one of the ones that I went to last week that was incredibly helpful was, it was from the Neuro Leadership Institute, and it was talking about how to be effective right now. And what's coming up for me is, as a society, we're at a very high level of threat, right? You said like we're in survival mode. And I think that is true for a lot of people. And when your body is in a high level of threat, it's like all of the energy is being driven to, how do I manage anxiety? Like, how do I calm myself down? How do I just, you know, get food on the table and survive? Your brain cannot, it doesn't have a lot of extra for creativity and generating new ideas. So that's why it's really essential to take good care of yourself right now. Drink a lot of water, go for walks, you know, take self-care more seriously now than you ever have, because you're going to need every tool in your toolkit to bring your threat levels down, to calm yourself enough for you to come up with some new ideas, because that's what the world needs right now. And so, you know, don't be afraid to be creative and laugh, and, you know, call the people that you love. And, you know, that's a really big, important part of this time too.
Thank you. Well said. All right.
Thank
Well,
you.
I want to thank you, everyone. Go ahead, Tony.
I was just going to say, this is my first time joining, and I caught wind, I think, through LinkedIn about this. I speak for the bizdiversity.net, and specifically, we've got a webinar going on April 23rd. And just, it's really good to kind of see that other people are focusing on this. It's an important topic, and even though we've got a lot of important things happening right now, I think it still needs to stay on the table. So thank you guys for putting this together.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. All right, well, yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining and for being thoughtful and making this a priority. We are both easy to find. It sounds like everyone knows Michaela, and she did put the Eventbrite for the talk that she has coming up. So feel free to reach out and connect with her. And I know if you need to chat with her personally, or if you need her help in your organization, she is amazing. As somebody said, Megan gave you a little shout out and said for folks to hire you, Michaela. So you need help with sustainable diversity initiatives. All right. Well, thanks everyone so much. And if there's anything else that you want, we're just, you know, kind of trying to bring people together and talk about things that are important to you and share information and resources. So if there's something that you would like to see, please feel free to send me a note on LinkedIn or Reverb. We're easy to find, and just let us know what you're hearing and what you think the community needs right now from a people standpoint. All right. Thanks so much. Thanks again, Michaela. It was really great to have you.
Yeah, this was really fun. Thanks for inviting me.
Awesome.
Great group.
Thank you. Take care.